Hi, I haven't made a video in quite a while, but welcome back to Actual Spinster. I wanted to make a video, but I didn't want it to just be like another wrap up, which was the last video I posted, and obviously July is ending pretty soon, so my July wrap up will be coming soon. Yeah, so this video is kind of like a stopgap, but I thought it could be nice and maybe interesting for some, and I've been struggling quite a lot to read recently. I just feel like even when you get used to how hard life is, it's still really hard. I just haven't really been having the energy to read, which makes me really sad. It's not really about like the number of books I've read, but obviously like that is an indication of how much I'm able to do, and I just haven't been able to read very much. This is also like a bit late. I guess it maybe would have been better to post at the beginning of July as more of like a 6-month roundup of 2021 reading in terms of classics, but I'm late, so whatever. So the first like classic that I read in 2021 was The Woman of the Wolf and Other Stories by Renée Vivienne, which are a collection of short stories, and they are kind of about gender variance and sexual desire and queerness. Some of them are kind of rewritings or writing back to myth and fairy tale, and also kind of like Torah or biblical stories. This collection tries to situate Renée Vivienne in a kind of like feminist canon, and I wouldn't 100% be against that reading, but I would be sort of against most of that reading. The introduction to this collection does kind of frame her as like a feminist icon, which I don't think she is, and I don't think she needs to be in order for her work to be interesting or read or preserved. These were written in, I think, or published around 1904, and they were originally written in French. I think Renée Vivienne is the one who was English but changed her name and moved to Paris. It's part of this like collection of like French classics. Yeah, it was translated by Carla J and Yvonne M. Klein. It's part of their Revolutionary Women series, and obviously like some parts of this I think are interesting and do coincide with some kind of revolutionariness, I guess, but I think there's a way that those words like feminist and revolutionary can just become super detached from any kind of real like economic understanding of power and gender and exploitation. So yeah, and a big strand throughout most of these stories, or well, maybe not all of them, it has been a while, but a bunch of them is like this very persistent and horrible like racism. I'd say like specifically like anti-native racism, and I also think that like in the stories some of them use racialization or like particular racialized people or bodies or ideas in order to kind of explore like a particular kind of gender non-conformity, which is, I mean, it's in the tradition of like some queer, like white queer writing, but yeah, it's quite uncomfortable, and yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to anybody who's just like looking for an interesting like translated French short story collection from the 1900s. Like, yeah. Next, I reread Passing by Nella Larsen, which I have spoken quite a lot about on this channel, so I will not. But this tells the story of two women in 1920s Harlem, Irene Redfield and Claire Kendry, who were childhood friends, but Claire passed over and is now passing for white and has like a white husband who's horrible. Yeah, it's very short and it's just sort of really brilliantly written. Like every word is like perfect, and the ending is incredible, and it's queer as well. Although I would say that I think often people take the title as passing, meaning both passing for white but also passing for straight, which I don't think is what Nella Larsen was doing with the title. I think concepts around passing or not passing are a more new queer idea, and obviously that's not to say people didn't, I guess, specifically choose to, my camera cut me off, but like yeah, passing in the way that we think of it now I don't think is how it was conceived of then. That isn't to say this story isn't queer or has like queer subtext / overt text. Oh, the next book I read actually that's a classic is the Odyssey, and I read the Emily Wilson translation by Homer, and this is the first translation into English that was written by a woman. There have been other translations into other languages by women. It was actually quite hard to get through, but I still did enjoy it. It's a book that I'm glad I reread. I think I found a lot of it quite moving, but I also was like, this is just about like men and like it's kind of boring too. So mixed experience with that one. It is something that I read before in a different translation. Like I know the story fairly well, I guess. Maybe not perfectly, but like quite a lot of it. And so, you know, it was like familiar, I guess is the word I was maybe looking for. I think my favourite parts of the translation were actually like Emily Wilson's like translator's note, which is like a couple pages, I think at the beginning of the book, which I read after I had reread the whole thing, which just talks really beautifully about translation, the art of translation, and then also the Odyssey as well as a text, and like what it grows inside of it, what it holds there, and how it kind of continues to hold us. So it was an enjoyable experience if it was also a bit kind of tiring and a little bit boring at points. Then the next classic I read was Kane by Jean Toomer. And this is another book I talked about in my 1920s reading vlog. And this is quite difficult to talk about. It's a kind of like polyphonic novel, and it's rhythmical and lyrical and sectioned into different spaces and times, and there are some motifs that repeat, chunks that are longer or shorter or whatever. There's songs, there's prayers. The back says it's an innovative literary work, part drama, part poetry, part fiction. This was published in 1923 during the Harlem Renaissance, and it's like supposed to be a very kind of pivotal book for that particular like movement, literary and like aesthetic movement. I found it quite hard to read. I found it upsetting to read. Yeah, I didn't particularly like it. I did listen to somebody reading it out loud, which I think was useful. It's on Spotify if you're interested. I would recommend that, but just because it is quite like a rhythmical, especially like parts of it where there are like songs and poems and things. So definitely not one of my favourites, but it was interesting in the context of learning more about the Harlem Renaissance and 1920s literature. The next one I read was The Hearing Trumpet by Leonora Carrington. This is about Marianne Leatherby, who's 92 I think, and is deaf, and she gets like a hearing trumpet for her birthday, and then she gets like shipped off to a like care home, but it's a kind of like weird, spooky, somewhat Christian, Satanist type place. There's like a nun, and it's this community of old women, and it's a little bit like apocalyptic. I think if you describe this in a particular way, it would be like, obviously I'm gonna love that book, but I didn't. I think it was written in the 50s and then published in the 70s, and there's definitely some language in here that I didn't like, some like descriptions of especially this like one black character that I didn't think were appropriate or sensitive. It could have been great, but it wasn't. But I was intrigued by some of the ideas it presents. There's also like a way that Leonora Carrington just like has life in the way that she like represents like bizarreness and like strange things in life in a way that's like so mundane it's actually quite hard to then deal with, because you're like, oh, this is normal? Is this normal? I'm confused. Then the next book I read was another translated short story collection, although there's actually just 2 books in here, so, and they're more like novellas, but whatever. But this is also part of the Revolutionary Women translated French fiction from Gallic Editions series. This is Three Rival Sisters by Marie-Louise Gagné, and it was translated by Anna Aitken and Polly McIntosh. There's another story in here called Atonement. I much preferred the first story to the second story. Atonement was about like murder and like this one relationship, and also, what's that thing that everybody used to take? Laburnum? Nope. Laudanum? Laudanum. But yeah, Three Rival Sisters is just like literally about these 3 sisters who this man visits their like French house with their dad who's unbearable, and they kind of are trying to get to marry him, and it's about what like the fortunes of each of the 3. Yeah, it was interesting. The things that I found most interesting actually is in the first one where they write stuff like this. The denouement is undeniably the most difficult part of a novel, which I think is very interesting in the context of like pushing against particular narratives in plots, so like writing with a self-awareness about that. I think it was originally published in the 1860s, I want to say. Let me see if that is correct. Yeah, 1861 and 1859 for the other story. These books were both present, so I'm glad to have read them, and I do think they're very beautiful, even if I had sort of mixed experiences with both, but this one I did enjoy more. The next book I read was actually a book that I've been reading for literally like a year, and that's Atonement by Edith Ellis, and this is a book that is about Rachel, who is a doctor's daughter, and she goes to London when she's maybe 19 or 20, 21, I can't actually remember, when she's like just becoming a woman, I guess. And she goes to London and she tries to figure out kind of like what to do with her life, how best to help people, and it is a bit about kind of Marxism and socialism. It was written in 1909, and I think it's set in the 1890s actually, and then it's sort of about alternative living as well, and what Rachel and the various people that she meets and befriends decide to do in order to live a true life, a brotherhood of new life. And I actually was quite disappointed in this. So I thought the book was going to be queer, but I mean maybe there's some queer readings you could put, but not enough for my taste. However, the next book I read was definitely queer and was definitely wonderful, and it's almost kind of what I was looking for the Atonement one for Edith Ellis, but with like women, is this one, which is Maurice by Ian Forster. All of these I obviously have spoken about. This book is kind of like a coming of age story about Maurice Hall. It's just, it follows him from when he's like at school until he goes to Cambridge, and that's where he meets Clive, and it's just about like his relationships, his growing understanding of himself, and I just think like the ending is absolutely wonderful, and I I love it a lot. I'm actually currently reading, okay, well that book is The Longest Journey, which was written in 1907 and this in 1913, and it's definitely a different novel, but I do feel like they're quite interlinked, especially at the moment, like in terms of how some working class characters are being represented, and I feel like maybe this demonstrates Forster's own development in terms of like political consciousness and class consciousness, because like so far at least I don't really like this one. Oh, this book is so beautiful. I would definitely recommend it. Then I read Quicksand by Nella Larsen, which is for me like an unsatisfying novel. It follows somebody who's called Helga Crane, who's mixed race, and like starts off the novel when she's like 22, 23, working in this like all-black school in the South, I think, and she is sort of like, I want to find something else, I want to find something better than this life, and so the novel's just her kind of trying to do that. She's quite an interesting main character, and I feel like I maybe read some stuff about how people think that Helga Crane is sort of like Nella Larsen's alter ego and stuff, which is interesting and sad too. It hasn't stayed with me very much, not in the same way as Passing has, and I didn't really like the ending, and I guess I was also just like really not expecting it to be what it was, which I think did change my experience with it, because I guess I was just also like expecting that I would love it in the same way that I loved Passing, even though Passing does also contain like some difficult stuff, but I didn't. So then I read The Quarry by Nan Shepherd, which is another kind of coming of age into early 20s, 25, whatever book that's from the 1920s. I guess Maurice is from 1913, but anyway. And this is a Scottish set book written in some dialogue, although the glossary at the back is actually pretty shit. And it's about a lonely, passionate, hard-working girl at the beginning called Martha, and her family and her experience at university, her experience falling in love, her experience with nature, and I think that was the most like beautiful part of it for me, is her experience with nature. And I just noticed that my camera is dying, so I gotta keep talking. Anyway, I gave this 5 stars, loved it, definitely would recommend it. Okay, now we're moving on to some of the books I read for my Summer with Sylvia project. I'm just gonna mention them here. So that's Mr. Fortune's Maggot and The True Heart. And then the next two are also ones I talked about in my most recent wrap-up, so again I'll just mention them. And that's The Tree of Heaven by May Sinclair, which I love, I would definitely recommend. And also The Tenement of Wildfell Hall, which I did love at the time and I gave 5 stars, but now looking back on it, like, it hasn't stayed with me as much as I thought it would. However, I do think it will be actually really great to reread, and it does have some ideas about women and working, and also like women's independence that I really liked and were different from sort of like other Victorian books that I've read. You know, it's very different from Jane Eyre. I feel like the way that it presents women's autonomy and selfhood outside of and against marriage is very different, I think, than Jane Eyre and even like Villette and stuff. The most recent one I read was a reread, and this was Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, which I obviously loved. I like how Sylvia Townsend Warner presents like Satan as like the most feminist man, basically, because he leaves Laura alone, and that's basically the best that men can do. The next that I'm going to read for this project is Summer Will Show. It's like the copy I have has like really small text, which also hasn't been helping, and like headaches and just being able to concentrate has all been very difficult at the moment. So, and then I guess like these ones are the 4 main ones I think that I would like recommend so far and have been my favourites: The Quarry, Maurice, The Tree of Heaven, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It's been like a mixed bag. I definitely want to read more classics written by people of colour. Some of the classics I've been reading have been for my ideas and proposal stuff, which also sort of constrains it a bit more, although I'm also sort of trying to research into other underknown and underrated classes, but they're really difficult to find or at least to have access to, so that's actually very frustrating and often a struggle, especially when the author is like marginalised in one or more ways. Yeah, it's a shame and frustrating. I mean, I'm hoping to read more books from the 1930s. I have managed to start one. I did start a 1930s reading vlog, and I will be updating it, and it will probably not be here for like 6 more months, but that's fine. And then I've got my Sylvia reading, and I've also got just like a bunch of these other things. I guess like I really want to keep reading like translated French books actually, and I think that's something I've been really enjoying this year. And I am also reading War and Peace right now, so hopefully one day I will. Oh no, I was also going to talk about this whole thing of like, what's interesting about charity shops is that they like managed to keep like a lot of like women who were published before the 2000s, and even then like in print, or at least like in circulation. That's actually how I should say it, not in print. And so I have been kind of thinking about doing some kind of like backlist women book reading project, because everybody's so focused on like what's coming out, which like is fine, but there's also just like this wealth of like really amazing work written by women. And again, like if you sit at kind of like the cross-section of multiple marginalizations, the likelihood of your voice being preserved or your books or work or whatever being preserved is even less. Doing my Sylvia Warner project, like one of the only reasons why you could find these in shops is because like this year, maybe last year, she got sort of like the Penguin Modern Classics like printing session, and even then, you know, you can only find like a couple of her works and not many, and you have to, you know, track them down in order to find it, and normally they have lolly, but yeah. And I think like, I just feel like that really speaks to how like women's voices in literary canons, even when they become canonical via publishing or yeah, being included on like a list, they're not actually being read, they're not actually being like read deeply or consistently or with good faith in a way that like a lot of male authors don't need to kind of cling on in order to be present in bookshops. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I guess I was just feeling like very grateful for charity shops for having books that like I wouldn't be able to find, or would be much harder to find or more expensive to find. I think that is like an important part of this kind of like bookish literary like canon or shape or space, and these three books, so Kane, Passing and The Quarry were all secondhand to me, and I can't quite remember, but I feel like I got these two in secondhand bookshops, charity shops, and like I wouldn't have been able to find them necessarily that easily. Some of these are also, I guess because it's like 1920, it's 2020s, and these are from the 1920s, they are finally getting more attention and stuff, but even then, like, it's, you know, and there's such a big difference between publishing a book and releasing like a new edition of it and people actually reading it and like engaging with it, and I think that's really sad. I think there's so many women's voices who are lost because of that, even if it looks like, oh, like Penguin publish 80 women on their 200 author list or whatever, but like, what does that actually mean? I guess like the fact that I went into this charity shop as well and I found these two books which are very unexpected and I hadn't heard of is also what prompted this, because this is Money by Victoria Benedictson, which is translated by Sarah Death from the Swedish, I think. Yeah, and this is a novel from the 1880s. I never ever heard of it, and like I went into this like charity shop and I got it for £1, and like I've never ever heard of this. There was no way I was even looking for it, let alone like thinking I would get it. And then this one is from the 1930s by somebody called Olive Moore. Moore's formal ambitions have a 1920s modernist character, so obviously I had to pick it up. One is reminded of Virginia Woolf's dense circular narratives. And then there was also this in the same place, and this was also for £1, and I just found it and stuff. Like, it's like there are so many books that you don't even know you should be looking for. It's also maybe a bit similar with like Leonora Carrington, like she is like canonical in one sense, but she's also like not, because people don't read her or know her really that much. Yeah, anyway, wow, that was like a long discussion, but I did get it all in, so that's great. Anyway, hopefully I'll be reading more and Money in the next part of the year, as well as a bunch more stuff. So let me know what you think about any of these, or if you've read any great classics this year, and I will see you soon. And yeah, I'm sorry for there being such an absence. I have been making some TikToks, but I think mostly it really just has been that like I haven't been reading / have just been struggling. If you're interested in reading Summer Will Show by Sylvia Warner, let me know. Maybe we could create like some kind of chat, and maybe that could also be a useful way to like actually read it and not be so put off by the tiny little text. Cool. I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!